Nuestro invitado de hoy nació en la India británica en una familia acomodada, pero comunista y atea. Estudió nada menos que en Oxford, convirtiéndose en el primer pakistaní en presidir su unión estudiantil. Durante las protestas contra la guerra del Vietnam, se convirtió en una referencia mundial y desde entonces no ha dejado de animar los debates intelectuales de la izquierda. En Otra Vuelta de Tuerka, Tariq. Hoy visita la Tuerka Tariq, que repite, porque ya estuvo en la Tuerka hace algunos años. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí.
Very happy.
Naces en la India británica. ¿Cómo es tu infancia en un contexto colonial como ese?
My childhood was quite strange because the family I was born into was a very feudal aristocratic family. But my parents, who were both from the same family, had broken with that and had become communists. So it was a strange feeling psychologically. The family is very right-wing, but my parents are very radical. So in our home, we always had a divide. On the one hand, trade union leaders, peasant leaders, left-wing intellectuals, poets, artists. That was the most interesting for me. And then on other occasions, the family would come, which was always very boring and formal and polite. And so for me, growing up in this radical milieu had a huge impact. And my father would always say, never forget that the feudal world is an empty world. It's empty, it's nothingness. The people we have to fight for are the poor. From a very young age, he said that. And so it clearly had an impact on me. And you know, being born in that society, the class divide is very visible. You see it all the time, in every small way and big ways. So I think that had a huge impact on me.
Enseguida empezaste a vincularte en política y participaste en movilizaciones contra la dictadura, lo que haría que tus padres te mandaran después a Inglaterra. ¿Pero qué recuerdas de esas primeras experiencias de movilización?
The first time, Pakistan was under a military dictatorship. All demonstrations were banned. You could be shot if you came out onto the streets. And we were at college, at university, and I read in the newspapers that Patrice Lumumba, the great leader of the Congo, had been killed by the Americans, by the Belgians, and he meant something to us. His country had just become independent. So I called a general assembly of students at the university and said, we have to march to the American Consulate General. We can't just sit here and do nothing. And they said, but I said, sometimes you have to take risks. And we came out of the college, marched through the streets, and people were amazed, but marched for Lumumba, carrying his picture, slogans, and we marched there and we came back and nothing happened. No one said anything. The university vice-chancellor, the head of the university said you shouldn't have done it, but that's all. This encouraged students, and 2 weeks later, there was a big demonstration against the reforms the government was pushing through in education. And now we were prepared and they were prepared. And at one key moment, the police said, if you cross this red line, we will open fire. And we had young students on scooters, you know, Vespas and all those beautiful old scooters of the 60s. And we had planned them. We said, okay, you guys, helmets on, you are going to charge through the police line and we will follow. So the police were completely surprised, and they did it. They were on motorbikes and scooters, and they charged through it, and then we rushed through, and the police opened fire, first in the air, and then they fired at us. And 2 students, not far from me, fell dead. So we lifted them and took them home. And the next day, 500,000 people came for the funeral, and the police didn't intervene because people were shocked that this had happened. And so gradually, the movement against the dictatorship built up. But then I had to leave. My parents were very worried I would be killed, and one of my uncles was in military intelligence, and he came and whispered in my mother's ear, "Get him out of the country or he will go." I was not in favor of leaving at all, but they just said, "You have to go."
Te quiero preguntar por ese cambio, porque llegas a Oxford, una de las universidades más elitistas del Reino Unido. Fuiste el primer pakistaní que llegó a ser presidente del sindicato de los estudiantes. Tienes debates incluso con Kissinger. Es la época de las movilizaciones contra la guerra del Vietnam. ¿Qué recuerdas de aquella experiencia universitaria en Oxford?
For me, it was favorable. Politics was beginning to develop in British universities. It was the very beginning. And so it was nice to be part of it. And the Vietnam War was beginning and escalating. And some of us became obsessed with this war. How can we help the Vietnamese? So we formed small groups. We started having demonstrations. Big discussions were taking place. I think the first teach-in, a big public debate, I organized it with 2 other colleagues, where we had the top American people coming to debate us, and the British Foreign Secretary, and then the anti-war people. And the BBC televised this debate, which was unheard of. And people said, "My God, there are 2 different opinions, not just one." That helped to start the rise of a radical student movement. And the other thing is, Pablo, in those days we didn't care about academic qualifications. And I bet my friends, I said, for the exam papers, in every single question, I will bring in Vietnam. And they said, "No, you can't do it. We know they will fail you." I said, "I'm going to do it." So I did it in politics, philosophy, economics, every question. This was the mood and atmosphere of those days, very radical, very challenging, and we had a Labour government in power which was supporting the Americans. So the combination was there for a big extra-parliamentary upheaval on Vietnam, and then, of course, 68 happened in France, and Czechoslovakia.
Estuviste muy vinculado en aquella época a grupos trotskistas y después, en 1990, escribiste Redemption, en el que ironizas mucho sobre esas tradiciones. ¿Por qué el trotskismo sigue prestándose a tantas bromas, a pesar de los elementos heroicos e interesantísimos, pero siempre se presta a bromas?
Well, many of us were part of those groups. Even when I was in, I could see the humorous side of it, that here we were, small groups of people, thinking we could make the world revolution, which was a very noble utopia. But constantly, especially in Britain, there were, 3 or 4 Trotskyist groups, each fighting the other.
3, 4, or 5. Yeah.
Each fighting the other. And in 1980, I left. I said, I can't bear it anymore. We are not in touch with reality, really. You don't understand what is happening in the world. So I left. I just moved sideways, wrote books, made films, documentaries. And Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator, was executed. And in that same week, one of the leaders of the most sectarian Trotskyist group also died. And at his funeral, there was a clash between 2 different factions of his group. His body is there, and they were fighting over who would bury him. And I said, one cannot deal with this. In reality, I have to write a fiction. So it took me 2 weeks to write Redemption. And it started off with the fight at the funeral. And then it became more and more surreal. I just got it out of my system like that. That style of politics and that way of organizing and the fantasy element in it, I said, we can never go anywhere with that. And of course, Redemption came out, and many people, as you can imagine, hated it. I lost many friends. But some of the better people stayed there. They laughed. They said, yeah, it's true. And I linked it to a way of religious functioning. So at the end of the novel, the World Trotskyist movement convenes. There's a huge congress where all the factions and sects come, and the leader tells them, okay, we have failed. Communism has collapsed. We were just a footnote to communism. We have failed, but there is a future. This is in 1990. I want you all to enter the three big religions of the world: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and we meet in 10 years' time, and I hope there will be Trotskyist Ayatollahs, Trotskyist mullahs, Maoist, etc., etc. And, you know, the funny thing is, Pablo, that my Egyptian friend said, you make jokes and you laugh, but in Egypt, the central leaders of the Maoist group joined the Muslim Brotherhood. And in Algeria, and some of them in Pakistan, they just went. You know, so from Chairman Mao, it was Chairman Muhammad. So my joke, unfortunately, had that side to it as well.
Ha sido, desde siempre, uno de los principales animadores de la New Left Review, probablemente la revista de pensamiento más interesante para la izquierda a nivel mundial. ¿Qué es lo que sigue representando esta revista? Porque te confieso que para mí es una referencia, es lo que nunca he dejado de leer.
Well, the interesting thing about this magazine is that when it was relaunched in 1962 and Perry Anderson became the editor, he was a complete and total internationalist. Before that relaunch, the magazine was very good, but largely concentrated on English problems and socialism and the debates on communism, but within largely an English-speaking framework. But when Anderson took over the magazine, he said, and he brought in a new team of young people, I want every single person to be able to speak another language. Otherwise, this project will not work. So Ronald Fraser, Spanish. Perry himself spoke Russian, German, French, Spanish. And then we had people who could speak Japanese and Mandarin. And all the main languages, including Serbo-Croat, were covered. And so their task was to read the publications, not just of the left, but all intellectual publications from the languages they knew, and bring that knowledge to bear so we could ourselves develop. I joined much later, but I know, of course, the history. And that was a big turn. And we then started translating books from all the European languages that had never been translated into English, especially from German and French, into our publishing house, New Left Books, which became Verso. So the project was an internationalist project. It did not privilege the English-speaking world, and it treated every country, every idea on its own merits. What to do when communism collapsed, because the magazine was very related to communism and the troubles within it. It was very critical, defended dissident communism. And Perry wrote this article that we have to register that a big defeat has taken place. It's not that you capitulate to the system, that was never for us, but you have to register that a huge defeat has taken place. It's a huge triumph for capitalism, and we have to be hard-headed and realist in how we function and how we critique. And so the magazine became, in a curious way, less abstract and much more concrete in analyzing the political crisis globally, country by country, opening up the magazine to ideas which sometimes we hadn't discussed before, and thus relaunching it. So we relaunched in 2000. And these two relaunches, both done by Perry Anderson, have of course been very popular and good for the magazine. The other thing, Pablo, is that even at the height in the 60s and 70s, we had 10,000 subscriptions and many library subscriptions. Now with the internet, it's transformed. We have a quarter of a million people download at least one article every 2 months. So it's a huge step forward for us and very positive.
Y desde que se empezó a traducir al castellano se abrió un nuevo mundo para la New Left Review. Te quiero preguntar ahora por América Latina, que ha sido uno de tus temas de interés. Yo recuerdo cuando leí Piratas del Caribe. Te querría pedir un balance de lo que ha ocurrido en los últimos 15 años. Sé que es muy difícil porque son realidades nacionales distintas, pero ¿qué es lo que ha cambiado en el mundo por lo que ha ocurrido en América Latina en los últimos 15 años?
You know, when I first met Hugo Chavez, it was on the first anniversary of the defeated coup. And in that coup d'etat that attempted to get rid of him, two countries were involved, the United States and Spain. And the first conversation I had with Chavez, it was very clear to me, some were more skeptical, that this was a leader of a new type who reflected the changes that were taking place in the world. So there was no bullshit rhetoric like we are going to destroy the capitalist system from A to Z. He understood that very early on. You cannot operate in the same way as you did in the 20th century. You have to challenge capital, regulate capital, control capital in the interests of the poor and working people and the peasants and all that. But to just imagine that you can destroy it is not going to work. That's been tried. So discussion, and you know, he was developing these ideas. He's one of the few political leaders I have met who actually read a lot of books. He liked reading books, and he actually read them, and he would raise questions with you. So this whole experience, which was triggered off by the Venezuelans, showed that you didn't need to sit still and say, oh, the system is too powerful, we can't do anything. Even within the constraints of the system, you had to challenge and come up with some ways of helping the majority of people. Otherwise, there would be disasters. They were helped, of course, by very stupid governments and weak states. I mean, that's just a fact. But I think the experiment, which is still carrying on, it has its ups and its downs, as we know, has been extremely important because it was the only continent which challenged neoliberal capitalism. That is, everyone accepts that. And that is why the financial press of the globalized world hated him so much. I mean, you know, you read the hatred in the pages of The Economist and the Financial Times and the liberal media. El País in particular was vitriolic against the Bolivarians and Chavez in particular. I had big fights with their journalists and other papers in there. And this was it. It's a bit like the attacks on Syriza and Cyprus. If these people do it, the example might spread. And the whole thing about neoliberalism and the way it functions, it's a dictatorship of capital. You know, it's the way capital wants to rule. This is what we want. These are the parties we have, which we are happy with. It doesn't matter if it's center-left or center-right. It's part of our system. Anything that challenges that is unacceptable. And the South Americans did it first, and they got away with it, despite the attempts to destabilize, to topple, to destroy. And therefore, the spread of this in a different way to the Mediterranean from the Caribbean has been extremely important. And the fact that both the Greek movements and the Spanish movements had links with South America, I think has been extremely important. So it's not over as yet. That's the important thing, it's spreading. And even in the United States, you know, when there was a hurricane crisis in New Orleans, Chavez and the Venezuelans offered help blankets to, African American areas which were very poor, which had some impact.
Quiero que pasemos ahora a Europa, empezando por el Reino Unido, con unas elecciones que nos han sorprendido a todos, no tanto por el éxito de los conservadores, como por una parte, la fuerza de UKIP y, por otro lado, que de alguna manera el Partido Nacional Escocés ha ocupado el espacio del Partido Laborista en Escocia con un discurso contra las medidas de austeridad. ¿Qué está pasando en Reino Unido?
I think that what we are watching is the breakup of the United Kingdom. The Scottish always felt, for hundreds of years, they were a different country. They were cheated into making a union with Britain, and they never felt part of it, and the English recognized that by accepting certain Scottish institutions. The key moment for Scotland in recent years was after the Second World War, the 1945 elections, and a Labour government won. And this Labour government under Attlee pushed through very radical reforms, which today would be considered unacceptable. Beginning free education, creating a national health service which was free for everyone, building public housing. These three measures, which if you ask for today, they say you're an extremist or a terrorist or whatever. In 1945, they had to do that because without it, there would have been rebellions and resistance. These measures had an effect on the whole country, especially in Scotland, because Labour was strong there. So this Attlee consensus, which was a left Keynesian social democratic consensus, delivered something to the Scottish people. So they felt quite happy. They didn't feel like leaving the United Kingdom. They said, why should, we're fine. We have, large numbers of Labour supporters in Scotland, the Scottish trade unions, more radical than the English trade unions. The Scottish intelligentsia had its own traditions. So they were, by and large, reasonably happy. And the whole question of home rule or leave alone independence disappeared. No one raised it till the victory of Margaret Thatcher.
His government has rolled back the frontiers of the state and will roll them back still further. And so popular is our policy that it's being taken up all over the world, from France to the Philippines, from Jamaica to Japan, from Malaysia to Mexico, from Sri Lanka to Singapore. Privatization is on the move. And there's even a special oriental version in China.
And the Scots felt, we've had 3 Thatcher governments. We didn't vote for her. So it was a democratic deficit. They said Scotland votes against her, but we have to suffer her and her neoliberal policies, which we don't like. So slowly, the Scottish National Party began to grow and grow by attacking Thatcherism from the left and being, even at an early stage, more radical than Labour. But it took a long time for Labour's hegemony in Scotland to be broken. That needed Tony Blair. And the combination of Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair's policies, which were a continuation, and the war in Iraq, which the Scots, the English hated it too, but the Scots even more. 95% of Scottish people said, we don't want this.
El dictador iraquí y sus armas de destrucción masiva son una amenaza para la seguridad de las naciones libres.
That began the shift, and it soon became unstoppable. So that when the last election, they lost, there was a referendum for independence, which the Scottish lost by 10%. And then the elite in London thought, it's going to win. We've defeated them. But the Scots were very interesting. They said, no, okay, we may have lost the referendum, but they were not depressed or demoralized. They carried on the campaign, and in the last election a few weeks ago, they won 56 out of 59 Scottish seats, which means that Scotland, which is the part of the United Kingdom where the Labour Party was born, which produced the first leaders of the Labour Party, where trade unions were totally Labourist, turned on its past and said, bye-bye Labour. We don't need you anymore. And that's created a huge, huge impact. And as for UKIP, UKIP is a bit like Ciudadanos. Its people come from the Conservative Party. Its main leader, Farage, is a former Conservative.
Mrs Thatcher recognised the truth behind the European project. She saw that it was about taking away democracy from nation states and handing that power to largely unaccountable people. Knowing as she did that the euro would not work, she saw that this was a very dangerous design.
It's only one elected member of parliament, Douglas Carswell, is actually quite an intelligent English nationalist. He's not stupid at all, much more intelligent than Farage. But the irony, well, not the irony, is that the English electoral system is very undemocratic. So UKIP, its main plank, there are two items. One, we don't want to be part of the European Union anymore, and they have pushed through a referendum which the Conservatives have granted. So there will be a referendum on Europe. The second is we are against immigrants. We are not against Asian or black immigrants. They came a long time ago and they are now part. But we are against Romanians, the Romanis, the Hungarians, all the Eastern European countries, the Poles especially, because they are taking our jobs away. And this, unfortunately, is quite popular. And then they are, some of the MPs are completely racist, comparing, sort of black members of parliament. So it's this combination of racism, nationalism, and xenophobia, which has won them 4 million votes. Now, Pablo, if these 4 million votes were represented in parliament, they would have 80 seats. 80. But the system works against small parties. The Greens won 1.1 million. They would have about 15 or 20 members of parliament. They have nothing. So that's the way that Cameron has won, with a minority of the popular vote. This has been the case for some years.
Respecto a la situación de los laboristas británicos, es imposible no acordarse de la tercera vía de Blair, que es algo que no se ha quedado solamente en el Reino Unido, sino que parece que afecta al conjunto de la socialdemocracia europea. Gerhard Schroeder defendió ideas parecidas e incluso en España el Partido Socialista defendió ideas parecidas, y no digamos ya el PASOK en Grecia. ¿Cómo ves la situación de esa socialdemocracia que se convirtió a una suerte de socialliberalismo que está limitando su capacidad de volver a ser un actor político crucial en Europa?
I think that what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union and that whole world is that effectively social democracy became redundant for the capitalist system. Its main function was to act as the voice of democratic socialism, as something to hold up against the Russians who, while they pushed through many reforms, didn't believe in democracy in any shape or form. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, for a long time. They were what I call the regimes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were social dictatorships, whereas social democracy offered reforms and democracy. And to a certain extent, this was a successful operation. But once the old enemy collapsed, why do you need to make concessions anymore? So neoliberal capitalism said no more concessions. This is turbocharged capitalism. We're going to move forward, crush everything in our way that stands in our way. What role was there for social democracy? None. So all they could offer was, well, we will mitigate the effects, the extreme effects of neoliberal capitalism. We will be capitalism with a human face. Give us a chance to manage the system. And when Blair came to power, the third way was, a spin doctor devised it for him, Tony Giddens, an academic who used to be on the left once upon a time. He came up with this thing, which meant absolutely nothing. It meant we're doing the same as Thatcher, but we're doing it slightly differently. Everyone saw through that quickly. So in my opinion, the Social Democrats and the Conservatives all over Europe are what you call the casta, I call it the extreme center. extreme in implementing austerity, extreme in waging wars, extreme in defending the system, and extreme now in taking away liberties with all the surveillance, the cancellation of the right to have a lawyer if you're imprisoned. All sorts of attacks on civil liberties are taking place. And this is the only model, and it can't last, Pablo. How can it last if they offer virtually the same things? So they concentrate on trivia, effectively to show, and politics becomes ultra for them personalized. Has Edward Miliband got a nice face? Does Cameron look better? Who is more effective? Who is wearing what? Politics more or less goes out of the picture.
Quiero preguntarte también por Grecia. El éxito de Syriza en Grecia fue algo que ha despertado muchas esperanzas. Nosotros tenemos una enorme simpatía por el gobierno griego, pero también nos está enseñando los límites de la política, los límites de la conquista del Estado por vías electorales en el marco de la Unión Europea y con buena parte de los poderes financieros en tu contra e incluso con sectores en tu propio país en tu contra. ¿Cómo juzgas estos meses de gobierno griego?
What it shows is the difficulties that will confront any government in Europe that comes to power and threatens not to change the system, but to impose some regulation on how capitalism functions, tax the rich, create certain things which are absolutely essential for people everywhere, whether it's Greece or Spain or the United Kingdom, anywhere. And there were huge hopes in Syriza. But I think the mistake they made strategically, long before they came to power, was that they overestimated their capacity to deal with the European elite, failing to see or not fully understanding that the way Europe is run is extremely undemocratic. So even the European Parliament has no powers at all. Effectively, all the decisions are made by the Council, who are representatives of the governments in power, and that the functioning of the European Union has become it's a machine for financialized capitalism. That is how it functions. Its economic institutions are created for that, and that the big country in Europe after the reunification is, of course, Germany. So you cannot ignore these facts. And I think they were too optimistic that because we are elected democratically, because these are our demands, which are modest demands, we will be able to convince the other Europeans. And it was, for the first 2 or 3 weeks, Varoufakis and Tsipras toured Europe, meeting people. And even the ones who were polite said, we can't back you. And I think then the realization came that it was going to be a very difficult operation. And then they wanted to crush them. The Germans wanted to crush this example. Schäuble, the German finance minister, shouted at Varoufakis. He said, don't talk to us about democracy. We know what your people have voted for, but that doesn't interest us. We're interested in what our people want, and the German people, and the Europeans. And so they were left with no margin for maneuver. And in my opinion, that is a very serious crisis now in Greece. And it's a strange situation because many people, especially older people, are frightened. And they play well on this fear. If you have voted for these people, what can they do for you? Better to come back to us. We will be able to help you out. But the Samaras and PASOK couldn't help them out, which is why people voted Syriza. So I think my own feeling is that they have to default now, that the situation is coming. Go to the people, say these are the options. We think we should default, and it will be hard, a bit harder than it is even now. But we are telling you the truth. We will then try and rebuild our economy, partially learning from some of the things the Argentinians did after their system completely collapsed. and appeal for solidarity, not just to the rest of Europe, but the rest of the world, China, Russia, the South Americans. I'm not saying it's easy, but something like that has to be done.
Quiero preguntarte también por nosotros. ¿Cuál es tu opinión sobre Podemos? Yo soy consciente de que hemos puesto patas arriba también muchas cosas al decir, por ejemplo, que la geografía izquierda-derecha no sirve para entender la realidad y aunque nosotros seamos de izquierdas, decimos que nos sentimos más cómodos hablando de los de arriba y de los de abajo y que apostamos por ocupar una centralidad del tablero que permite el cambio. ¿Cómo ves desde la distancia lo que estamos haciendo nosotros?
For me, it doesn't matter what you say you are. For me, Podemos is a movement in broad terms of the left. It's not the traditional left, it's not the social democratic left, it's not the Izquierda Unida left of the Communist Party attached constantly to social democracy. It's a new left in a way, which is learning new lessons. And I think the Spanish people understand this fact very well. It's not a big secret for them. So you, Pablo, and others can say, you know, it's neither left nor right, but they really know you're on the left. And I think that is not going to change quickly unless you do something which is so crazy that we're all angry with you. So I think that the emergence of Podemos is, of course, of key importance, not just for Spain, but also offering ideas to Northern Europe that this is the way to go. I know now that after the defeat of the left in England, the brutal, punishing defeat, there are many, many people, young people especially, activists who like the Podemos model in most senses and want to create a similar movement stroke organization that can begin to unite what's left. And they are talking very openly, publicly with each other, organizing in different parts of the country. So I think that this development has been extremely important. I think one thing should never be forgotten. My reading of the situation is that whether it's the extreme right or the new left, one thing that has helped it, crucially, is its decision to break with the existing parties of the left, center-left and center-right, obviously, the extreme center. This break with the extreme center is crucial, both for Syriza, which was helped by PASOK. For you, the situation is more difficult because PSOE is not collapsing of its own accord, for the reasons you know better than me. So it means a cleverer set of tactics and strategy, but these, in my opinion, should not include any concessions to PSOE. You know, this is a corrupt party on many levels, politically bankrupt, socially unable to offer people anything. There was a small period when Zapatero called back the Spanish troops from Iraq. He had to do that because that's why he won that election, which was very close, if you remember. But then they reverted, you know, to carrying on the old policies, neoliberal policies. I think if Podemos, even regionally, were to do any deals with them, it would be a disaster, really. People would then say, and you know, people don't think completely strategically. They would say, so it's a party like any other party. We made a mistake. Let's walk away, especially less political people. I have to say that. So I think for Podemos' own integrity, it's very important that it operates like it has been operating as a totally independent party, intervening in the political arena in Spain and saying we are the only ones who offer you a real alternative. And I think more and more, as the general elections approach, you will have to spell out that alternative, even in 4 big demands. You know, this is what we believe in. This is what we will do if we come to power. We're not just about talking simply. We're about action, about doing things. And we are the only people in this country who will be able to deliver you that. The PP, of course, wouldn't even look at this, and PSOE is wrecked and finished. And I think that will create at least a base for victory if you don't win this year. in 3-4 years' time. I mean, that's what happened with Syriza as well. They didn't win the first time, they won the second time.
Estamos llegando al final, nos queda el cuestionario y la rueda de reconocimiento. Empezamos con el cuestionario, un libro.
You know, this is a question I'm asked often, and I have to say that there is no single book. I have to be honest with you. For me, there is no Bible. The books, which of course have had a huge impact on me, not surprising, Marx, Capital, but not just Capital, his political writings, his analysis about France, the biography of Trotsky by Isaac Deutscher, which is a work of literary genius, even if you don't agree with everything in it. It's a wonderful book, but in a way, even not more than them, but in a different way, all the novels I read as a young person. You know, some very foolish, but very adventurous. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas, and later as I grew, Stendhal, who was a real revolutionary in my opinion, Balzac,
yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. And then living in a communist household, one had the advantage of communist Russian culture coming in with Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, etc., etc. So it's the combination of this that has made me what I am.
Una película.
Well, you know, the films that have marked me the most, I have to be straight with you, the films I used to love in the 60s and 70s was Buñuel. It was Buñuel who was so wonderful, and you know, his sort of particular way of anarchism. They were very anarchist films in many, many ways.
Totalmente.
And very brilliant. And of course I liked them, but also they were my favorite, the Buñuel films. They were very special. But then the French New Wave, the Italian social realist films, especially Francesco
Rossellini.
Just wonderful filmmakers. And more recently, I've been watching the films coming out of the Philippines, from Taiwan, Iran, and it's interesting that as the European cinema has declined or become a sort of version of Hollywood, the margins, so-called, of the cinematic world are becoming more and more powerful. Of course, in the 80s and 90s, Almodovar's films were important for me. And whenever I used to come to Spain, people used to say, what do you think of Spain? And I used to say, there are two Spains. There's the Spain of the Catholic Church, and there's the Spain of Pedro Almodovar. And I'm in favor of his Spain.
I agree with you in this case. Un líder político de referencia para ti.
I think a benchmark political leader for the 21st century for me has been Hugo Chavez. He has had a big influence on me. I've had many conversations with him over the years, and he's had a big impact. And often I used to say that to him and to others, that if Chavez and the Venezuelan and the Bolivarians could develop the organizational skills of the Cubans, and the Cubans could learn from the Bolivarians the importance of democracy, we would have a perfect match in South America. The last time I met Ernesto Laclau, we were in the Argentinian embassy in London. He gave a talk and he wanted me to be the main commentator on it, and I was critical but friendly. And I said, Ernesto, tell me something. And I'm going to bring two guys who you're very critical of these days, but it's interesting. He said, who? I said, Marx. Marx said something about the state, which in the 60s and 70s we used to say, it's too reductive, it's too simplistic. But I said, now, under neoliberal capitalism, when Marx said that the state was the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, we see it very clearly, especially after 2008, when this executive committee bailed out the system. So he smiled. And I said, the second is a quote from Lenin. He said, what's that? He says, politics is concentrated economics. And I said, think about how neoliberalism functions. their politics has just become, bourgeois politics is concentrated economics. They don't think like that. We think differently for an alternative form of politics, but they don't. He just looked at me.
Ok. Llegamos al final, a la rueda de reconocimiento. Yo te doy un nombre y tú puedes responder con una o dos frases como máximo. Henry Kissinger.
Liar, war criminal, cheat, asshole.
Margaret Thatcher.
Mediocrity, insensitive, no understanding of the country she was ruling, and encouraging greed.
Tony Blair.
Vomit. One of the worst politicians we have had, with no originality at all, except a master at winning elections on the basis of extremely right-wing politics, who has now become one of the richest politicians in the history of Britain, making money as Prime Minister and using what he did as Prime Minister to become a billionaire.
Malcolm X.
A wonderful human being, died before his time and was killed when he was arguing for blacks and whites to unite to fight the system. And predicted in the conversation I had with him, I said, I hope to see you next year, Malcolm. And he said, you won't see me because I'll be dead. And I said, dead? I was a kid. Dead? He said, yeah, the FBI, the black Muslims, they're going to kill me because now I've become too dangerous for them. And I never believed him, and I should have.
Antonio Gramsci.
A genius. Absolute genius. When you think of him, his life, his birth in Sardinia, suffering from malnutrition physically, and one of the finest minds that Europe has ever produced. And in his prison cell, writing these elliptic, disguised statements, warning the left of what awaited them if they didn't understand how important it was to win over the consent of the majority. One of the most important revolutionaries that Europe has produced.
Nikos Poulanchas.
A friend, a good guy, developed many ideas when he was alive, especially on the state, challenging traditional views, and I wish he was alive today so we could discuss with him and how he would have changed. And his suicide was a very sad event. You know, we needed him. And he would have been alive. He would have been, you know, a bit older than me, but he would have been there. And so we miss all these people who died.
Ernesto Laclau.
Another friend who I didn't agree with on many things, but who it was always a pleasure to argue with and debate with, because he was very open in debate. You know, he didn't say, no, don't say that. He said, fine, yeah, I think you're wrong, this is why you're wrong. So one could argue and discuss and debate with him. I remember we ran a very sharp, savage attack on him by Norman Garras in the New Left Review, which he didn't like, and he replied to it. But then when Norman Garras moved to the right, became an ultra-Zionist and supported the Iraq War, Nestor walked into the New Left Review office and said, see, this is what happens to my critics. This is where they go. And we just laughed.
And Perry Anderson.
Perry Anderson is a difficult one because he is one of my oldest friends and a comrade now, you know, for over nearly 50 years, at least 45 years. And I've known him and his work very well. And I think about Perry, we can say something which it's difficult to say about many other people we've mentioned, that when he writes his essays, he enriches the whole political culture. Not just the culture of the left, but the political culture of intellectual life as a whole.
Llegamos al final, Tariq. Te entrego la taza de la tuerca. Tienes que cogerla con la mano izquierda y mirar a esa cámara y brindar por lo que tú quieras.
To victory.
Muchísimas gracias. Gracias de verdad.